The courtroom had seen plenty of difficult people walk through its doors. But the moment Vivienne Hartwell crossed the threshold, something shifted in the air, the way a storm changes the smell of everything before the first drop falls. She moved like she owned the floor, the bench, and the people sitting on it. Her coat alone cost more than most people's rent. Her chin was tilted at an angle that said she had never once waited in line for anything. Judge Judy was already seated, papers arranged, glasses on. The cameras from the network crew rolled slowly, tracking Vivienne's entrance the way nature documentaries track predators. Careful, curious, waiting to see what would happen next. The bailiff, a solid man named Reeves, stood by the bench with his hands clasped. He had seen arrogance before. He had seen entitlement in every flavor. But something about this woman made him shift his weight quietly, almost unconsciously, closer to the bench. Vivienne reached the plaintiff's table and placed a single manicured hand on its surface, not to steady herself but to claim it. Judge Judy looked up slowly. "Name," she said. One word. "Fleen." Like the first cut of a scalpel. The woman smiled, the kind of smile that expected applause. "Vivienne Hartwell," she said. "Wife of Mayor Douglas Hartwell. I assume you've heard of him." A low murmur moved through the gallery. Judge Judy let it fade on its own, the way a teacher lets a classroom settle before speaking. Then, in the same unhurried tone, she replied, "I've heard of him. You, however, are the one standing in my courtroom, so let's keep the focus where it belongs." Vivienne blinked, just once. A flicker of surprise she recovered from almost immediately. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I'm here because I'm suing my former personal chef, Mr. Darius Webb, for breach of contract and defamation. He walked off a job I was paying him generously for, and then had the nerve to go online and make me look like some kind of tyrant." From across the aisle, a man rose slowly. Darius Webb, mid-40s. Apron creases still visible on his forearms even in a dress shirt. He stood with the quiet dignity of someone who had decided, perhaps for the first time in a long while, not to make himself smaller. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady. "I left because I was asked to do things no person should be asked to do. And when I said no, I was threatened." Vivienne turned to him with a look that could have frozen glass. "Threatened," she repeated, as if the word were a joke. "I told you your employment would be terminated. That's not a threat. That's a consequence." Judge Judy's pen tapped the bench once. "Miss Hartwell," she said quietly, "you'll get your turn. Right now, I'd like to hear from Mr. Webb." Without interruption, Vivienne opened her mouth. "Without," Judy repeated, her tone taking on that particular edge. Calm enough to be polite, firm enough to be absolute. Interruption. The courtroom held its breath. Vivienne sat back slowly, crossing her legs, smoothing her coat as though the whole thing were merely a minor inconvenience she was graciously enduring. Darius exhaled quietly and began. The story he told was simple. He had worked for the Hartwell household for 3 years. He had cooked for dinner parties, political fundraisers, private family gatherings. He had been professional, punctual, and proud of his work. Until the morning Vivienne Hartwell looked at the meal he had prepared, pushed the plate across the marble island, and said, "You people need to remember who feeds you. And it's not your talent, it's my money." The gallery stirred. Judge Judy's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. "When you say you people," Judy asked evenly, "Mr. Webb, was there any indication of what she meant by that?" Darius nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor, there was." A silence fell over the room, heavy, loaded. And in that silence, Vivienne Hartwell smoothed the lapel of her coat, gazed at her nails, and sighed as if she were waiting for a late train. The camera caught all of it. Every single second. Before we go any further, welcome to Miller Media. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because we bring you the most powerful courtroom moments that remind us all what justice truly looks like. And we want to know, where are you watching this video from? Drop your city and country in the comments below. We love seeing our community from around the world. Now, let's get back to the courtroom, because things are about to get a whole lot more intense. Judge Judy set her pen down with the kind of deliberateness that made the small sound feel enormous. She looked at Darius Webb with steady eyes. "Mr. Webb," she said, "you mentioned you were asked to do things no person should be asked to do. I'd like you to be specific." Darius straightened. He had prepared for this moment, not to perform it, but to survive it. "There's a difference. Mrs. Hartwell asked me to prepare meals and label them as organic, locally sourced ingredients for her husband's campaign events," he said carefully. "But the ingredients she provided weren't organic. She had me use standard bulk grocery items and then sign off on documentation that said otherwise. The campaign was advertising these events as community-conscious farm-to-table fundraisers. People were donating based on that image." The courtroom shifted. A different kind of murmur this time, not gossip, alarm. Judge Judy's gaze moved slowly, deliberately toward Vivienne. Vivienne uncrossed and recrossed her legs. "That is an extraordinary exaggeration," she said, her tone airy and unbothered. "We occasionally substituted ingredients when our supplier ran short. That's called running a household, not fraud, Miss Hartwell," Judy said. "I didn't ask you yet. I know, but I simply can't sit here and let him, Miss Hartwell." The room snapped to silence. Judy's voice had not risen, it never needed to. It had simply landed with the weight of someone who had spent decades making sure the truth had a place to sit down. "When I ask you," Judy continued, "you'll speak. Until then, you'll listen." Both skills appear to need some work. A ripple of barely suppressed reaction moved through the gallery. Even the court reporter's fingers paused for just a fraction of a second. Vivienne's jaw tightened. Her smile didn't disappear entirely. It just became something else, something colder and more calculated. The smile of a woman reminding herself she was better than this room. Darius continued. "After the third event, I told Mrs. Hartwell I wasn't comfortable signing the documentation anymore. I said I thought it was misleading to donors and potentially illegal." He paused. "She laughed." "She laughed," Judy repeated. "Yes, Your Honor," then she said. He glanced down at a small notepad he'd brought to the stand, the kind of notepad a person keeps when they know one day they'll need evidence. She said, "Darius, do you know what you are in this house? Your appliance. Appliances don't have opinions. They just run until I unplug them." The gallery reacted, gasps, whispers. One woman near the back audibly said, "Lord have mercy." Judge Judy let the reaction breathe for exactly 2 seconds. Then she raised one hand and the room quieted as if on a string she controlled. She turned to Vivienne. "Miss Hartwell," she said, and there was something in her tone now. Not anger, but a kind of surgical patience. "Would you like to respond to that?" Vivienne spread her hands gracefully. "I speak colorfully. My husband's staff has always understood that." Darius was oversensitive. "I was under enormous pressure planning those events. If I said something colorful, it wasn't meant to be taken literally." "Colorful." Judy repeated the word the way you repeat something you want the room to remember. "Yes," Vivienne said confidently. "I have a vivid way of expressing myself. Anyone who knows me understands that." Judy leaned forward just slightly. "And would anyone who knows you also understand referring to a human being as an appliance?" A beat of silence. "That," Vivienne said, lifting her chin, "is entirely out of context." "Then give me the context," said simply. Another beat. Longer this time. Vivienne's lawyer, a lean man named Prescott who had been growing progressively more pale since the proceedings began, leaned toward his client and whispered something urgent. She ignored him entirely. "The context," she said slowly, as if choosing each word like a chess piece, "is that I run a household of significant public importance. My husband serves this city. That means our home, our events, our image, all of it reflects on the people. I hold my staff to exceptional standard because the public deserves exceptional." Judy studied her for a long moment. "Miss Hartwell," she finally said, "you just told me that calling a man an appliance was in service of the public good." Vivienne blinked. "That's not exactly that," Judy said quietly. "Maybe the most honest thing you've said since you walked in here." The courtroom erupted softly, not in laughter, but in the collective exhale of people watching something they wouldn't soon forget. Vivienne's composure flickered, just for a moment, like a signal losing connection. The bailiff Reeves studied the ceiling. Darius Webb sat with his hands folded on the table, his expression not triumphant, just steady. The expression of a man who had waited a long time to be in a room where the truth was louder than the money. Judge Judy picked up her pen again. "Mr. Webb," she said, "you mentioned you were threatened after refusing to sign the documents. Can you walk me through what happened next?" Darius nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "That's when things got worse." He opened his folder, and the courtroom leaned in. Darius Webb opened his folder slowly, the kind of slow that isn't hesitation, it's precision. The movements of a man who had rehearsed this moment not for drama, but for survival. He placed 3 documents on the table in front of him, side by side, like evidence laid at the foot of a truth that had been waiting too long to stand up. "After I refused to sign the catering documentation for the 4th fundraiser," he began, his voice measured and clear, "Mrs. Hartwell called me into her study. Alone, Judge Judy's eyes didn't move from his face. She told me that if I didn't cooperate, she would make sure I never worked in this city again," she said. He glanced at his notepad. She said, "I am the mayor's wife, Darius. Do you understand what that means? In this city, I am God, and God decides who eats." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a chair creaked, not a pen moved. Even the cameras seemed to hold still. Judge Judy sat back slowly in her chair. Her expression remained composed, but something behind her eyes sharpened into a point so fine it could have cut the air between them. "She said she was God," Judy said. "Not a question. A measurement." "Yes, Your Honor." Judy turned toward Vivienne Hartwell with the unhurried calm of someone who has all the time in the world precisely because they hold all the power in the room. "Miss Hartwell," she said softly, "would you like to address that?" Vivian let out a short, polished laugh, the kind designed to make the person across from you feel foolish for taking things seriously. Your Honor, I was speaking metaphorically. I was making a point about influence, about the reality of our position in this community. She gestured elegantly with one hand. Surely you understand that people in public life speak in terms of power. It's motivational language. Judy repeated. Yes, like a coach pushing an athlete. Judy tilted her head slightly. A coach who tells an athlete they control whether he eats. Vivian's smile thinned. A metaphor, Miss Hartwell, Judy said, her voice dropping to that particular register. Low, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone done being patient without ever raising their volume. Metaphors are meant to illuminate truth, not bury it. Vivian's lawyer Prescott closed his eyes briefly, the expression of a man counting the cost of every word his client was spending. Darius continued. 2 days after that meeting, I received a phone call from a restaurant I had been in final negotiations with. I had been offered a head chef position, a real opportunity. He paused, steadying himself. They called to tell me the offer was being rescinded. They didn't explain why, but they sounded nervous. Judge Judy's pen tapped once. And you believe Mrs. Hartwell was responsible for that? I didn't have proof then, Your Honor. He reached into his folder and produced a printed email. I do now. The bailiff Reeves stepped forward and collected the document, carrying it to the bench with the gravity of someone transporting something fragile and important. Judge Judy studied it. Her eyes moved across the page with quiet efficiency. Then she looked up. This, she said, is an email from an account registered to the Hartwell household domain, sent to the owner of Carmen's restaurant, the establishment that rescinded your offer, stating, and I'm reading directly here, it would be in your best interest as a business operating in this city to reconsider your recent hiring decision. Some employees carry baggage that attracts the wrong kind of attention. The mayor's office notices these things. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, in outrage, the contained, electric kind that fills a room when people hear something they immediately recognize as wrong. Judge Judy raised her hand. The room settled. She set the email down carefully, as though placing it exactly where it needed to be in the record of this day. Then she looked at Vivian Hartwell. Vivian was no longer smiling. She was doing something more dangerous. She was calculating. Her eyes moved quickly, privately, running through options the way someone does when they realize the exit they plan to use has just been blocked. Miss Hartwell, Judy said, is that your household's email domain? A pause. Prescott leaned in urgently. Vivian moved her hand slightly, brushing him away like something irrelevant. Our household has several staff members who manage communications, she said carefully. I couldn't possibly be responsible for every email sent under our domain. So your position, Judy said, is that someone on your staff sent this email without your knowledge. That's possible. Yes, and it's also possible, Judy continued, her tone even, that this same unknown staff member happened to target the specific restaurant where Mr. Webb had just been offered a position, days after you personally threatened his livelihood. Vivian's jaw tightened. I didn't threaten anyone. Judy looked at her steadily. Mr. Webb, do you have anything further to support your account of that private meeting? Darius reached into his folder one final time. He produced a small digital recorder, old model, scratched on one corner. The kind of object that looks insignificant until you understand what it carries. I started recording our private conversations after the first time she threatened me, he said quietly. I didn't know if I'd ever need it. I just knew I needed to protect myself. Vivian's face changed completely, not into anger, not into defiance, into something raw and more telling than either. Fear. Her lawyer stood immediately. Your Honor, any recording made without consent, Counselor, Judy said, cutting him off cleanly. Will address admissibility momentarily. Sit down, he sat. Judy looked at the recorder, then at Vivian, then back at Darius. Play it, she said. The bailiff carried the recorder to the court's audio system. A click, a hiss of background sound. Marble floors, the faint echo of a large room, and then crisp and unmistakable, a voice that belonged to only one person in the courtroom. I am the mayor's wife, Darius. Do you understand what that means? In this city, I am God, and God decides who eats. You want to test that? Go ahead. But don't come crying to me when every door in this city closes in your face, because I'll be the one who closed them. The recording ended. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Judge Judy sat perfectly still for a long moment, the kind of stillness that isn't emptiness, it's judgment forming, precise and inevitable as gravity. Then she turned to Vivian Hartwell. Vivian was staring at the audio system as though she could reach into it and pull the words back out of the air. Miss Hartwell, Judy said, her voice quiet as snowfall and twice as cold. I believe we've just met the real mayor's wife. The gavel came down once, sharp, final, echoing through the room like the first crack in something that had been pretending to be solid for a very long time. The echo of the gavel hadn't fully faded before Vivienne Hartwell's lawyer was on his feet. Prescott moved with the desperate energy of a man trying to plug a dam with his bare hands. His voice was controlled but strained, like a rope pulled 2 inches past its limit. Your Honor, I'd like to address the admissibility of that recording. My client was in her private residence. There was no reasonable expectation that, Counselor, Judge Judy said without looking up from the document in front of her. In this jurisdiction, a single-party consent law applies to recorded conversations. Mr. Webb was a participant in that conversation. He had every legal right to record it. She looked up then, her gaze landing on Prescott with the precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this objection. Do you have anything else, or shall we continue? Prescott sat down slowly. He had the look of a man mentally updating his resume. Vivienne turned to him sharply, her voice a controlled whisper sharp enough to carry. Do something. Mrs. Hartwell. I said do something. Prescott, that's what I pay you for. Judge Judy's eyes lifted from her papers. Miss Hartwell, she said. This courtroom has excellent acoustics. Please keep that in mind. A few members of the gallery pressed their lips together, suppressing reactions they couldn't quite contain. The court reporter typed steadily, missing nothing. Vivienne straightened in her chair. She adjusted the collar of her coat. She lifted her chin. These were the gestures of a woman reaching for her armor and finding it slightly less solid than before. Your Honor, she said, her voice recalibrated to its original smooth register. I'd like the opportunity to explain the context of what was recorded. You'll have it, Judy said. After I ask Mr. Webb a few more questions. She turned back to Darius. Mr. Webb, after the restaurant offer was rescinded, what happened to your career? Darius folded his hands on the table. I applied to 14 positions over the following 4 months, Your Honor. Restaurants, catering companies, private households, places I had worked with before. He paused. I received 0 callbacks. 0, Judy said. Yes, Your Honor. After 11 years of consistent work in this city, I couldn't get a single callback. He exhaled slowly. I lost my apartment. I moved in with my sister. I had to pull my daughter out of her after-school program because I couldn't afford it anymore. The gallery was completely still. Judge Judy studied him for a moment. Not with pity, with attention. The focused, respectful attention of someone taking a full account. Did you attempt to find out why you weren't receiving responses? I did, he said. One hiring manager, a woman I had worked alongside for years at a catering company, called me privately. Off the record, she told me. His voice caught slightly. He steadied it. She told me that word had come down through channels connected to the mayor's office that I was a liability. That hiring me would create complications for any business operating in the city. The word complications landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples moved visibly through the gallery. Judge Judy set her pen down. She looked at Vivienne Hartwell with the expression of someone who has heard enough to form a verdict, but is professional enough to hear everything. Miss Hartwell, she said, you may now provide your context. Vivienne rose smoothly. She had spent the last several minutes reconstructing herself, and the result was impressive. If you didn't look too closely at her hands. Your Honor, she began. What you heard on that recording was a woman under significant stress, speaking in the hyperbolic language that, frankly, powerful people use every day. My husband runs this city. The pressures on our household are immense. When I said what I said to Darius, I was frustrated. I was speaking emotionally, not literally. She paused, letting that settle. A's for the email. I genuinely do not know who sent it. We have 3 household managers and 2 communication staff. Any one of them could have acted independently, trying to protect our family's reputation. Judge Judy listened to all of it without expression. Then she said, so your position is that the recording was hyperbole, and the email was unauthorized? Yes, Your Honor. Both pieces of evidence that directly corroborate Mr. Webb's account. Taken out of context, yes. Judy looked at her steadily. Miss Hartwell, you've used the phrase out of context 4 times in this proceeding. I want to ask you something directly. She leaned forward slightly. What context makes it acceptable to tell an employee that you are God and you decide whether they eat? Vivienne opened her mouth. And please, Judy added quietly, don't say metaphor. The gallery reacted. A wave of barely suppressed sound. Someone actually laughed, then caught themselves. Even Reeves, the bailiff, shifted with the careful expression of a man fighting his own face. Vivienne closed her mouth. For the first time since she had walked into the room tilting her chin at the world, she had nothing ready. The silence stretched. And into that silence walked something unexpected. The courtroom doors opened at the back. Every head turned. A woman entered. Young, late 20s. Professional blazer. Sensible shoes. A leather portfolio held tight against her chest. She had the look of someone who had argued with herself for a long time before deciding to show up. The bailiff moved toward her immediately. Ma'am, proceedings are in session. I know, she said. Her voice was steady despite the tremor underneath it. I'm sorry. I'm Claudette Morris. I was Mrs. Hartwell's household communications manager. She looked toward the bench. I sent that email. The courtroom detonated, not in noise, in electricity. The kind that makes the air feel suddenly alive and dangerous. Judge Judy raised her hand. Silence returned instantly. She studied the young woman at the back of the room. Then she looked at Vivian Hartwell. Vivian had gone very, very still. The kind of still that isn't composure. It's the stillness of someone watching the last door close. Miss Morris, Judge Judy said calmly, please come forward. Claudette walked down the aisle slowly, her heels quiet on the courtroom floor. When she reached the front, she stood with the slightly shaking courage of someone who has decided that being afraid is no longer a good enough reason to stay silent. Judge Judy looked at her with steady, patient eyes. You sent the email to Carmen's restaurant. Yes, Your Honor. On whose instruction? Claudette's eyes moved briefly, just briefly, to Vivienne Hartwell. Then back to the bench. Hartwell told me to send it, she said clearly. She wrote the language herself. She dictated it to me word for word and told me to send it from the household account, so it couldn't be traced directly to her personal email. The room erupted. Reporters typed with sudden ferocity. The gallery buzzed with the uncontainable energy of people witnessing something they knew mattered. Vivian's voice cut through it all, sharp and sudden. You signed a non-disclosure agreement. Claudette, you are in breach. Miss Hartwell. Judge Judy's voice landed like a thunderclap wrapped in ice. Sit down. The command was so absolute that even the reporters paused. Vivian sat. Her lawyer put his head in his hands. Judge Judy looked at Claudette Morris with an expression that carried something beyond professionalism. Something that recognized what it costs a person to walk into a room like this and tell the truth anyway. Miss Morris, she said quietly, non-disclosure agreements cannot be used to conceal illegal activity. You should know that what you've just done took courage. And this court recognizes it. Claudette nodded, exhaling slowly, as if she had been holding that breath for months. Judge Judy turned back to Vivienne Hartwell. Vivienne was staring at the table in front of her. Her perfectly manicured hands were flat on its surface, not posed, not performing, just still. The gavel came down once, deliberate and final. We'll take a brief recess, Judge Judy said, and when we return, Miss Hartwell, we're going to have a very different conversation than the one you came here prepared for. She rose. The cameras followed her, but every eye in the room drifted back to Vivienne Hartwell, sitting alone in the wreckage of the story she had told herself for years. The one where she was untouchable, the one where she was God. The recess lasted exactly 12 minutes. Not because anyone needed 12 minutes, but because some truths need a moment of air around them before they become permanent. When the courtroom doors reopened, the energy inside had changed completely. The casual observers had leaned forward in their seats. The reporters had stopped whispering to each other. Even the ceiling lights seemed somehow brighter, more unforgiving, the way morning light finds every crack in a wall that darkness had hidden all night. Vivienne Hartwell returned to her seat without the entrance she had made 3 hours earlier. No tilted chin, no performance. Just a woman in an expensive coat who suddenly looked like she was wearing someone else's clothes. Her lawyer Prescott sat beside her, his silk tie loosened by exactly 1 centimeter. The physical equivalent of a man quietly surrendering. Claudette Morris sat in the witness area, her portfolio on her lap, her posture carrying the particular dignity of someone who has already paid the hardest price and is no longer afraid of what comes next. Darius Webb sat at the defendant's table with his hands folded, his eyes forward, waiting, patient in the way that only people who have spent a long time being ignored learn to be patient. Judge Judy entered and sat without ceremony. She arranged her papers. She adjusted her glasses. She looked out at the room. Then she spoke. Before we continue, she said, her voice measured and deliberate, I want to address something directly. She paused, her eyes moving to Vivian. Miss Hartwell, during the recess my clerk verified the timestamp on the non-disclosure agreement your team referenced. Another pause. It was dated 4 days after Mr. Webb submitted his initial complaint to this court. The room stirred. Judy continued without waiting for the reaction to fully form. Which means the non-disclosure agreement wasn't a standard employment document. It was created specifically to silence a witness after legal proceedings had already begun. Vivian's lawyer was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, the timing of that document. Counselor, Judy said, turning to him with the calm authority of someone who has already done the math. Witness tampering and obstruction are serious allegations. I'd encourage you to think very carefully about every word you say next. Prescott stood for exactly 2 more seconds. Then he sat down. He didn't say another word for the rest of the proceedings. Judge Judy turned back to the courtroom. Miss Morris, she said, I have a few questions for you. Claudette straightened. Yes, Your Honor. How long were you employed by the Hartwell household? 2 years and 4 months, Your Honor. And in that time, was this the first instance where you were asked to send communications designed to harm someone's professional reputation? Claudette's hands tightened slightly on her portfolio. No, Your Honor, it wasn't. The gallery murmured. Judy raised her hand. Silence. How many times, to the best of your recollection? At least 6 that I was directly involved in. Claudette said carefully. There were others I was aware of that went through different channels. 6. The word sat in the room like a weight dropped on a glass table. Everyone waited to see if it would crack. Judge Judy wrote something on her notepad, slowly, deliberately. The scratch of her pen was the only sound. Then she looked up at Vivienne Hartwell. Miss Hartwell, she said, you came into this courtroom today as the plaintiff. You filed a defamation suit against a man who, by every account this court has received, told the truth about how you treated him. She let that sit for a moment. Do you understand the position you are now in? Vivienne looked up. Something had shifted in her face during the recess. The calculation was still there, but underneath it, something else had begun to surface. Something she had kept buried under marble floors and designer coats, and the borrowed power of a title she had never actually earned. I understand, she said quietly. Good, Judy said. Because I want you to hear this clearly. She set her pen down and folded her hands. You weaponized your husband's position to destroy a man's career. You fabricated an NDA to silence a witness. You instructed staff to send threatening communications to businesses. And you walked into this courtroom today and called all of it context. She paused. It is context. Just not the kind you intended to provide. Vivienne's lips parted slightly. No words came out. Judy continued. Power, Miss Hartwell, is not a crown you inherit by marriage. It's a responsibility you earn by how you treat the people who have less of it than you do. Her voice remained level, almost gentle, which somehow made it more devastating. You told Mr. Webb you were God, but in this courtroom I've watched God's work, and it looks a great deal more like Mr. Webb's folder of evidence than your coat of armor. The gallery reacted. Not loudly, but deeply. The sound of people feeling something true. Vivienne's eyes glistened. She blinked rapidly. The practiced composure of a woman who had decided long ago that public tears were a weakness she couldn't afford. But the pressure behind her expression was visible now, real and mounting and impossible to fully contain. Then something happened that no one in the room had anticipated. She spoke without being asked. I grew up with nothing, Vivienne said. Her voice was different now, stripped of its gloss, raw underneath in a way that sounded almost unfamiliar coming from her. Nothing. We had nothing. And I watched people with money treat people like us like we were furniture, like we were invisible. She stopped, swallowed. And I told myself that when I finally got there, I would never let anyone make me feel small again. The courtroom was absolutely still. Darius Webb looked at her, with something more complicated and more human than anger. Judy watched Vivienne carefully. Her expression didn't soften into sympathy, but it opened. Slightly, precisely, into understanding. Miss Hartwell, she said quietly. What you just described is a wound, I recognize it. A pause. But a wound is not a license. Pain is not a permission slip. And becoming the thing that hurt you is not survival. It's surrender. Vivienne closed her eyes. One tear escaped. Just one. She didn't wipe it away. Judy let the silence hold for a moment. Then she continued. The tragedy of what you've done isn't just what it cost Mr. Webb. It's what it cost you. Every time you crushed someone beneath the weight of your position, you buried a little more of the person who climbed out of nothing. She tilted her head slightly. That person deserved better than what you became. The room was so quiet that the ventilation system was audible above their heads. Darius Webb looked down at his folded hands. Claudette Morris pressed her lips together, eyes bright. Even Prescott, the defeated lawyer with the loosened tie, looked up from the table with an expression that had moved past professional into something more personal. Judge Judy reached for her gavel. But she didn't lift it yet. She looked at Vivienne Hartwell one final time with the expression of a woman who has seen the full architecture of a human mistake and is choosing, carefully and deliberately, what to do with that knowledge. You said you are God in this city, she said softly. But God, whatever you believe about that word, doesn't rule by making people afraid. God, if we're being precise, is the reason this courtroom exists at all. She lifted the gavel. So that people like Darius Webb have somewhere to go when people like you forget that. The gavel came down. Not like thunder this time, like a door closing on everything that had come before. And in the silence after it, Vivienne Hartwell sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes open, finally looking at something she had been avoiding for a very long time herself. The recess lasted exactly 12 minutes, not because anyone needed 12 minutes, but because some truths need a moment of air around them before they become permanent. When the courtroom doors reopened, The energy inside had changed completely. The casual observers had leaned forward in their seats. The reporters had stopped whispering to each other. Even the ceiling lights seemed somehow brighter, more unforgiving. The way morning light finds every crack in a wall that darkness had hidden all night. Vivian Hartwell returned to her seat without the entrance she had made 3 hours earlier. No tilted chin, no performance. Just a woman in an expensive coat who suddenly looked like she was wearing someone else's clothes. Her lawyer Prescott sat beside her, his silk tie loosened by exactly 1 centimeter, the physical equivalent of a man quietly surrendering. Claudette Morris sat in the witness area, her portfolio on her lap, her posture carrying the particular dignity of someone who has already paid the hardest price and is no longer afraid of what comes next. Darius Webb sat at the defendant's table with his hands folded, his eyes forward, waiting, patient in the way that only people who have spent a long time being ignored learn to be patient. Judge Judy entered and sat without ceremony. She arranged her papers. She adjusted her glasses. She looked out at the room. Then she spoke. "Before we continue," she said, her voice measured and deliberate, "I want to address something directly." She paused, her eyes moving to Vivian. "Miss Hartwell, during the recess my clerk verified the timestamp on the non-disclosure agreement your team referenced." Another pause. It was dated 4 days after Mr. Webb submitted his initial complaint to this court. The room stirred. Judy continued without waiting for the reaction to fully form, which means the non-disclosure agreement wasn't a standard employment document. It was created specifically to silence a witness after legal proceedings had already begun. Vivian's lawyer was on his feet instantly. "Your Honor, the timing of that document." "Counselor," Judy said, turning to him with the calm authority of someone who has already done the math. "Witness tampering and obstruction are serious allegations. I'd encourage you to think very carefully about every word you say next." Prescott stood for exactly 2 more seconds. Then he sat down. He didn't say another word for the rest of the proceedings. Judge Judy turned back to the courtroom. "Miss Morris," she said, "I have a few questions for you." Claudette straightened. "Yes, Your Honor." "How long were you employed by the Hartwell household?" 2 years and 4 months, Your Honor." "And in that time, was this the first instance where you were asked to send communications designed to harm someone's professional reputation?" Claudette's hands tightened slightly on her portfolio. "No, Your Honor, it wasn't," the gallery murmured. Judy raised her hand. Silence. "How many times, to the best of your recollection?" "At least 6 that I was directly involved in," Claudette said carefully. "There were others I was aware of that went through different channels." 6. The word sat in the room like a weight dropped on a glass table. Everyone waited to see if it would crack. Judge Judy wrote something on her notepad slowly, deliberately. The scratch of her pen was the only sound. Then she looked up at Vivian Hartwell. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "you came into this courtroom today as the plaintiff. You filed a defamation suit against a man who, by every account this court has received, told the truth about how you treated him." She let that sit for a moment. "Do you understand the position you are now in?" Vivian looked up. Something had shifted in her face during the recess. The calculation was still there, but underneath it, something else had begun to surface. Something she had kept buried under marble floors and designer coats and the borrowed power of a title she had never actually earned. "I understand," she said quietly. "Good," Judy said, "because I want you to hear this clearly." She set her pen down and folded her hands. "You weaponized your husband's position to destroy a man's career. You fabricated an NDA to silence a witness. You instructed staff to send threatening communications to businesses. And you walked into this courtroom today and called all of it context." She paused. "It is context, just not the kind you intended to provide." Vivian's lips parted slightly. No words came out. Judy continued. "Power, Miss Hartwell, is not a crown you inherit by marriage. It's a responsibility you earn by how you treat the people who have less of it than you do." Her voice remained level, almost gentle, which somehow made it more devastating. "You told Mr. Webb you were God. But in this courtroom I've watched God's work, and it looks a great deal more like Mr. Webb's folder of evidence than your coat of armor." The gallery reacted, not loudly, but deeply, the sound of people feeling something true. Vivian's eyes glistened. She blinked rapidly. The practiced composure of a woman who had decided long ago that public tears were a weakness she couldn't afford. But the pressure behind her expression was visible now, real and mounting and impossible to fully contain. Then something happened that no one in the room had anticipated. She spoke without being asked. "I grew up with nothing," Vivian said. Her voice was different now, stripped of its gloss, raw underneath in a way that sounded almost unfamiliar coming from her. "Nothing. We had nothing. And I watched people with money treat people like us like we were furniture. Like we were invisible." She stopped, swallowed. "And I told myself that when I finally got there, I would never let anyone make me feel small again." The courtroom was absolutely still. Darius Webb looked at her, not with anger, with something more complicated and more human than anger. Judy watched Vivienne carefully. Her expression didn't soften into sympathy, but it opened, slightly, precisely, into understanding. "Miss Hartwell," she said quietly, "what you just described is a wound. I recognize it." A pause. "But a wound is not a license. Pain is not a permission slip. And becoming the thing that hurt you is not survival. It's surrender." Vivienne closed her eyes. One tear escaped. Just one. She didn't wipe it away. Judy let the silence hold for a moment. Then she continued. "The tragedy of what you've done isn't just what it cost Mr. Webb. It's what it cost you. Every time you crushed someone beneath the weight of your position, you buried a little more of the person who climbed out of nothing." She tilted her head slightly. "That person deserved better than what you became." The room was so quiet that the ventilation system was audible above their heads. Darius Webb looked down at his folded hands. Claudette Morris pressed her lips together, eyes bright. Even Prescott, the defeated lawyer with the loosened tie, looked up from the table with an expression that had moved past professional into something more personal. Judge Judy reached for her gavel. But she didn't lift it yet. She looked at Vivienne Hartwell one final time with the expression of a woman who has seen the full architecture of a human mistake and is choosing, carefully and deliberately, what to do with that knowledge. "You said you are God in this city," she said softly. "But God, whatever you believe about that word, doesn't rule by making people afraid. God, if we're being precise, is the reason this courtroom exists at all." She lifted the gavel. "So that people like Darius Webb have somewhere to go when people like you forget that." The gavel came down, not like thunder this time, like a door closing on everything that had come before. And in the silence after it, Vivienne Hartwell sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes open, finally looking at something she had been avoiding for a very long time. Herself. The gavel's echo had barely settled into the walls when the courtroom doors opened again. Not dramatically, not with the charged electricity of Claudette Morris's entrance. This time it was quieter, more deliberate. The door opened and a man in a gray suit walked in carrying a briefcase that looked like it contained something heavy, not in weight. In consequence, he was followed by two others. Suits. Serious faces. The particular expression of people who work in offices where the stakes are always high and the language is always careful. Judge Judy looked up. The man in gray approached the bench and handed a document to the bailiff Reeves, who carried it forward with the measured pace of someone suddenly aware that the afternoon had become something significantly larger than a defamation case. Judy took the document. "Read it." Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted, the way a horizon changes when weather is coming from a direction nobody was watching. She set the document down. "For the record," she said, her voice carrying its usual authority but layered now with something weightier beneath it. "This court has just received a formal notice from the City Ethics Commission, filed this morning." She looked up. "It appears Mr. Webb's case is not the only complaint currently under review involving the Hartwell household." The room broke open. Reporters were on their phones before Judy had finished the sentence. The gallery erupted in a noise that wasn't quite chaos but was pressing its face against the window of it. Judy's hand rose. The room pulled itself back together. Vivienne Hartwell had gone the color of old paper. Her lawyer Prescott stared at the document in Judy's hand as if it were a photograph of his own career ending. Judge Judy continued, her tone unhurried and precise. "The Ethics Commission has received 7 independent complaints over the past 14 months, all citing interference by persons connected to the mayor's office in private employment matters, business licensing decisions, and municipal contract awards." She looked directly at Vivienne. "Several of those complaints reference a woman matching your description, Miss Hartwell, operating with what witnesses describe as explicit authority from the mayor's office." Vivienne's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "I want my attorney," she said. The words came out smaller than anything she had said all day, the voice of someone who had just watched the floor change into something she didn't recognize. "You have your attorney," Judy said calmly, glancing at Prescott. Prescott looked like a man who very much wished he was somewhere else. A garden perhaps, a quiet room with no cameras. "Miss Hartwell," Judy continued, "I want to be precise about what this means for today's proceedings. This court is not the Ethics Commission. I am not here to try those cases." A pause. "But I am here to consider the full picture of evidence presented to me. And what this document tells me is that what Mr. Webb experienced was not an isolated incident of a stressed woman speaking carelessly." Her voice dropped slightly, taking on that quality that made it feel like the room had gotten smaller and more honest. It was a pattern, deliberate, sustained, and protected by the assumption that the mayor's name was a wall nothing could climb over. Vivienne closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had changed in them. Not remorse exactly. Not yet. but that the particular exhaustion of a person watching a structure they built with enormous effort collapse with the casual efficiency of something that was always going to fall. I didn't know about the other complaints, she said quietly. Judge Judy studied her. Didn't know or didn't ask? Vivian looked at her hands. She didn't answer. Judy let the silence make the point she didn't need to make with words. Then she turned to Darius Webb. Mr. Webb, she said, I want to give you an opportunity to speak before I move toward my ruling. Not about evidence, not about facts, she paused. About what this cost you in your own words. Take your time. Darius looked up slowly. He was quiet for a moment, not gathering courage. He had already done that, but gathering language precise enough to carry the weight of what he needed to say. Your Honor, he began. I didn't come here for money. I want to say that clearly. His voice was even unhurried. I came here because my daughter asked me why I stopped cooking. She's 9 years old and she used to watch me in the kitchen and tell me I made food that tasted like a hug. He paused. And I didn't know how to tell her that someone decided I wasn't allowed to cook anymore. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I said no to something that was wrong. The courtroom was carved from silence. I lost 11 months, he continued. 11 months of my career, my apartment, my confidence. Some mornings I didn't get out of bed because I didn't know what getting out of bed was for. His jaw tightened slightly. And during all of that, Mrs. Hartwell was posting on social media about charitable causes and community events and lifting people up. He looked at her then, direct, clear, without malice. I don't hate her. I want to say that too. But I need her to understand that words from people in power don't just disappear when the conversation ends. They follow people home. Vivian Hartwell looked at Darius Webb, really looked at him. Perhaps for the first time, a tear moved down her cheek. She didn't stop it this time. Judy watched all of it with the steady, experienced attention of a woman who had spent decades understanding that justice is rarely just about the law. Sometimes it's about the moment when two people finally occupy the same truth at the same time. Thank you, Mr. Webb, she said softly. She turned her attention back to the full room, the cameras, the gallery, the reporters with their pens now resting, not typing, just listening. I want to say something, Judy began, her tone shifting slightly, stepping for a moment out of the strict enclosure of judicial language and into something more direct, more human. About power, and about the people who confuse having it with deserving it. The room leaned in collectively. Every person who walks into this courtroom carrying a title, a name, a position, a balance in their account. They arrive here believing that those things will protect them. She looked around the room slowly. They don't. They never have. What protects you? What actually keeps you standing when everything else is stripped away, is the way you treated people when you thought no one important was watching. She let that breathe for a moment. Vivian Hartwell arrived here today as the mayor's wife. Her gaze settled on Vivian. She'll leave here as herself. And the question of whether those two things can coexist in a way she can be proud of, that's not for this court to answer. A pause. That's for her. Vivian pressed her fingers to her lips briefly. A private gesture that the cameras caught and the room respected enough not to react to. Judy straightened her papers. Before I deliver my ruling, I'm going to ask one final question. She looked at Vivian directly. Miss Hartwell. Knowing what this court now knows, the email, the recording, the NDA, the Ethics Commission complaints, the 11 months Mr. Webb lost, and the 9-year-old girl who stopped watching her father cook. Is there anything you would like to say to Mr. Webb directly? The question landed in the room like something irreversible. Vivian Hartwell sat with it. The cameras waited. The gallery waited. Even the reporters waited, pens still, because some moments are too important to divide your attention during. Slowly, Vivian turned in her chair to face Darius Webb directly. She opened her mouth, and for the first time all day, nobody in the room could predict what was going to come out of it. The silence before Vivian spoke was the longest silence of the entire day. Longer than the pause after the recording played. Longer than the moment Claudette Morris walked through the door. Longer than the quiet that followed Darius's words about his daughter and food that tasted like a hug. This silence was different because it was chosen. Vivian Hartwell was choosing it. Sitting inside it, feeling the full weight of a room full of people watching her decide who she actually was underneath everything she had built on top of it. She turned her chair slightly, facing Darius Webb fully. No angle, no profile designed for cameras, just one person turning to face another with nothing left to hide behind. She exhaled. Mr. Webb, she began. Her voice was quiet and polished, the kind of voice a person has when they stop performing and start speaking. I have been trying to find the right words since I sat down in this room. She paused. I don't think there are right words. I think there are just honest ones. Darius watched her, still, steady. I told you that you were an appliance, she said. I told you I was God. I told you I would close every door in this city." She stopped, swallowed. "And then I did it. Not because I was angry in a moment and said something foolish, but because I picked up the phone and I made calls, and I used every connection I had to make sure you couldn't stand up after I knocked you down." The courtroom was so quiet that the lights above them hummed audibly. "That wasn't power," she said. "That was fear. I've been afraid my whole life that someone would find out I didn't deserve any of this. The house, the title, the position." Her voice cracked slightly at the edges. "And whenever someone got close enough to see me clearly, I destroyed them before they could say anything." Darius Webb's expression was unreadable, not cold, just careful. The expression of a man deciding in real time what to do with something unexpected. Vivian continued. "Your daughter asked you why you stopped cooking." She closed her eyes briefly. "I have a son, he's 12, and he asked me last month why I always look angry." She opened her eyes. "I told him I was just focused. Driven. I told him successful people look like that." A pause. "But sitting here today, I think he was asking me the same question your daughter was asking you, just in different words." Something moved through the gallery. Not a sound, a feeling. The particular human response to watching someone tell the truth about themselves in public when it costs them everything. Judge Judy sat with her hands folded, watching Vivienne with the careful attention of someone who has heard 1,000 apologies in this room, and knows the difference between the ones that are performed and the ones that are real. This one was real, flawed and incomplete and arriving 11 months too late, but real. "I'm sorry, Mr. Webb," Vivian said. "Not for this courtroom. Not for the cameras." She glanced briefly at the lens pointed at her face, then back to Darius. "I'm sorry because what I did to you was wrong. Because you were a person doing honest work and I treated you like a problem to be managed." Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "And I'm sorry about your daughter. And the after-school program. And the 11 months. And every door I closed." She stopped. "I can't give that back. I know that." Darius Webb looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, slow and deliberate. Not forgiveness necessarily. Not yet, but acknowledgement. The recognition that something true had just passed between them in a room full of strangers and cameras and consequence. "Thank you," he said quietly. 2 words, carrying more weight than anything either of them had said all day. Judge Judy observed the exchange without interrupting it. When it had settled completely, she unfolded her hands and reached for her pen. "Miss Hartwell," she said. Her tone had changed, still authoritative, still precise, but carrying something additional now. Something that recognized the moment that had just occurred without sentimentalizing it. "What you just said to Mr. Webb was the most important thing you've said in this courtroom today." A pause. Perhaps in longer. Vivian looked at her. Tired, honest, smaller than she had arrived, which somehow made her more. "I want to deliver my ruling now," Judy said. "And I want to do it completely." She opened the file in front of her, turned several pages with methodical precision. Then she looked up at the room. "This court finds entirely in favor of the defendant, Darius Webb." She spoke clearly, each word placed with care. "The defamation suit brought by the plaintiff is dismissed with prejudice. The evidence presented today demonstrates conclusively that Mr. Webb's statements regarding his treatment were not defamatory. They were factual." The gallery reacted with a restrained but audible release of tension. The sound of people who had been holding their breath for hours finally letting it go. Judy continued. "Webb is awarded full compensatory damages covering 11 months of lost income, documented at the rate of his previous salary. He is additionally awarded damages for emotional distress and professional harm." She looked at her papers. "The total to be determined by this court's calculation, but I want the figure to reflect not just what was lost, but what it cost to lose it." Vivian's lawyer wrote something on his notepad. His hand was steady, but his face wasn't. "Furthermore," Judy continued, her tone taking on a more deliberate weight, "this court is formally referring today's proceedings to the City Ethics Commission, with a recommendation for full investigation into the pattern of conduct evidenced here. That investigation will include the email to Carmen's restaurant, the post-complaint NDA, and the 6 additional incidents referenced by Miss Morris." She set her papers down. "This court does not decide those outcomes, but this court absolutely has an obligation to make sure the right people have the right information." She looked at Vivian directly. "Miss Hartwell, you will not be ordered to make a public apology by this court." A pause that made the room uncertain for a moment. "Because an ordered apology is a performance, and you've done enough performing." Her eyes held Vivian steadily. "What you said to Mr. Webb just now, that was yours. Keep it. Build something from it." Vivian nodded slowly. Her diamond bracelet caught the light one more time. But it looked different now. Not like armor, not like a weapon, just jewelry. Just metal and stone on the wrist of a person sitting in the consequences of her choices, trying to figure out what comes next. Judy turned to address the room fully. "I've been in this chair for a long time," she said. "Long enough to know that the cases that matter aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes the most important thing that happens in a courtroom is quiet." She glanced toward Darius. A man gets his name back. A woman finds something real underneath all her noise. She paused. Today was both. She looked at Claudette Morris, sitting with her portfolio and her courage, and the particular grace of someone who did the right thing knowing it would cost her. "Miss Morris," she said, "this court formally notes your cooperation and your honesty. Whatever comes next professionally, you carry something more valuable than a letter of recommendation. You carry your integrity intact." A brief pause. "Don't spend it cheaply." Claudette pressed her lips together and nodded, her eyes bright and steady. Judy reached for her gavel. She held it for a moment without bringing it down, looking at the room, the cameras, the gallery full of people who had come in expecting a spectacle and were leaving with something they hadn't anticipated. A story about what happens when power forgets it's borrowed, and what happens when truth, patient, persistent, unhurried truth, simply waits for the room to get quiet enough to hear it. "Court," Judge Judy said, her voice carrying one final time through the marble and the light and the silence that had become, over the course of this long extraordinary day, something almost sacred. The gavel came down, not like thunder, not like a crack or a warning or a weapon, like a period at the end of a sentence that finally said exactly what it meant. The sound rolled through the room and faded, and in the quiet that followed, something settled. Not just the case, something larger and older and more important than any single verdict. The understanding that no title, no address, no bracelet, no borrowed name, no amount of money or influence or social media followers had ever protected anyone from the oldest and most democratic force in any room. The truth, which had been here all along, waiting. The courthouse steps the next morning were washed clean by the previous night's rain. The stone gleamed quietly in the early light. No cameras, no reporters, no crowd pressing forward with microphones and questions shaped like weapons. Just the ordinary sounds of a city waking up, traffic finding its rhythm, birds negotiating the overhead wires, a street vendor arranging cups with the unhurried efficiency of someone who does the same thing every day and finds dignity in the repetition. Darius Webb came down those steps alone. He wore the same dress shirt as yesterday, but his shoulders were different inside it, not broader exactly, just more settled. The posture of a man who had put something down after carrying it for so long he had forgotten what his arms felt like, empty. A single reporter lingered at the bottom of the steps. Young, earnest-looking, she raised her recorder tentatively. "Mr. Webb, how does it feel?" Darius paused on the last step, looked at the recorder, then passed it at the street beyond. "You know what I'm going to do today," he said. She shook her head. "I'm going to cook breakfast for my daughter." He smiled. Small and private and entirely real. "She likes French toast with too much syrup. I haven't made it in almost a year." He walked past the recorder and into the morning. The reporter stood watching him go. Then she lowered her device and just watched. Because some moments are better witnessed than captured. Across the city, in a penthouse that had always felt more like a museum than a home, Vivian Hartwell sat at her kitchen island. No staff, she had given them the morning off. No phone, it was face down on the counter, buzzing with the relentless appetite of a world that wanted her reaction, her statement, her performance. She wasn't performing today. In front of her sat a single cup of coffee, gone cold, and a legal pad on which she had been writing since 5 in the morning. Not a press statement. Not a social media caption crafted to control the narrative. A letter. To her son. It was 3 pages long already, and she wasn't close to finished. She wrote slowly, crossing things out, starting sentences again, trying to find language honest enough to explain to a 12-year-old boy why his mother had spent years looking angry and calling it ambition. She didn't know if she would ever give it to him, but she kept writing, because the alternative was going back to the woman who walked into that courtroom yesterday. And that woman, she had finally understood, was not someone she could afford to be anymore. The coffee sat cold and untouched. The pen kept moving. Outside the penthouse windows, the city went about its business entirely indifferent to the quiet revolution happening at that kitchen island. The private, unglamorous, enormously difficult work of a person deciding to change. Claudette Morris was already at her desk by 7:30. Not the Hartwell household desk. That chapter was closed. The non-disclosure agreement rendered unenforceable by the court's referral to the Ethics Commission. A fact her new employer had noted with interest when they called her the previous evening. A non-profit, community advocacy. The kind of organization that exists specifically to help people navigate the systems that people like Vivienne Hartwell had spent years learning to manipulate. Her new desk was smaller. The office was noisier. The salary was considerably less impressive. She had never felt more correctly placed in her life. She opened her laptop, made her first call, listened carefully to the person on the other end. Someone who needed help. Someone who had been told by someone powerful that their voice didn't matter. It matters, Claudette told them simply. Let's talk about what we can do. She pulled out her leather portfolio and began. Prescott, the lawyer with the loosened tie and the haunted eyes, submitted his resignation from the Hartwell legal team by email at 8:15. It was 3 sentences long: professional, firm, final. He spent the rest of the morning on the phone with the State Bar's Ethics Council, voluntarily disclosing his awareness of the document irregularities. He had been advised by 3 colleagues not to make that call. He made it anyway. Some things he had decided somewhere between yesterday afternoon and this morning cost more not to do than to do. He hung up the phone and sat quietly for a moment. Then he loosened his tie the rest of the way and took it off entirely. It felt, surprisingly, like breathing. Judge Judy was in her office before the building had fully come to life. This was not unusual. She had always preferred the courthouse before it filled with noise and need, and the complicated daily business of human beings failing, and trying and failing again, and occasionally, on the best days, getting something right. She sat with her tea and her files, and the particular quiet of a woman who had spent decades in rooms full of other people's storms, and had learned to carry her own stillness into them like an anchor. On her desk sat a single file. Yesterday's case. She would complete her final notes this morning and pass it to the appropriate channels. The Ethics Commission would do what it would do. The city would process the information in the slow institutional way cities process things. That was not her concern this morning. Her concern this morning was a small detail she hadn't mentioned in the courtroom. After Vivienne Hartwell had left the building yesterday, after the cameras had packed up and the gallery had emptied and Reeves had straightened the chairs with his usual methodical care, Darius Webb had stopped at the door. He had turned back, and he had said to her, quietly, in the empty room, "Your Honor, thank you for letting me finish my sentences." She had nodded, said nothing. But she had thought about it all evening. Such a small thing. Being allowed to finish your sentences. Being given the space to complete your own thoughts in a room where someone with more power was present. Such a small thing that it shouldn't need thanking. And yet here was a man, 11 months of his life taken from him, his daughter's after-school program gone, his mornings gutted of purpose. And the thing he chose to name in gratitude was being allowed to finish his sentences. She picked up her pen and wrote something in the margin of her notepad. The smallest dignities are the ones people remember longest, because those are the ones most often stolen. She underlined it once. Then she set her pen down and drank her tea, and watched the light come fully through the window, and fill the room with the particular gold of an ordinary morning that had no idea how important yesterday had been. 3 weeks later, a small article appeared not on the front page of any major publication, but in a local community newsletter. Former chef opens pop-up kitchen in Eastside Community Center. The article was short, 4 paragraphs. A photograph of Darius Webb standing behind a folding table covered in food, his daughter beside him wearing an apron 3 sizes too large, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. The pop-up was free, open to anyone. Every Saturday morning, French toast was on the menu, with too much syrup. The article mentioned that the pop-up had already served over 200 people in its first 2 weeks. That 3 local restaurants had reached out offering Darius part-time consulting work. That one of them, a small place on the corner of Meridian and 5th, had offered him something more. A kitchen of his own. He had accepted. The Ethics Commission investigation took 4 months. Its findings were significant enough to make the front page of every major publication that had missed it in the small community newsletter. Mayor Douglas Hartwell issued a public statement expressing full cooperation with investigators. He looked, in his press conference photograph, like a man who had recently learned something about his household that he wished he had learned differently and considerably earlier. Vivienne Hartwell did not appear at the press conference. She was, according to those who knew her, spending considerably more time at home, with her son, teaching him reportedly how to cook. She was not good at it yet, but she was learning. On the last Saturday of that month, a woman sat in a small cafe on the east side of town. She stirred her tea slowly, watched the street through the window. A familiar figure passed by, Darius Webb, walking with his daughter, her hand in his, both of them moving with the easy, unhurried rhythm of people who have nowhere to be except exactly where they are. He glanced through the window. Their eyes met. He raised a hand, a simple acknowledgement, the gesture of one person recognizing another across glass and distance. Judge Judy raised her cup slightly in return, her version of a standing ovation. The two of them held the moment for exactly as long as it needed to last. Then Darius Webb looked back at his daughter, said something that made her throw her head back and laugh with the full unguarded abandon that belongs exclusively to children who feel safe. They walked on. Judge Judy watched them until they turned the corner. Then she set her cup down and opened the file she had brought with her. The next case. There was always a next case. People failing and trying. Arriving in rooms carrying their worst moments and their last hopes and the complicated, tangled truth of their lives. She picked up her pen, ready, always ready. Because somewhere in this city, right now, someone needed a room where the truth could finish its sentences. And she intended to keep providing one. The narrator's voice settled in slowly, soft and certain as the end of a long day. Power, they say, is what you do when no one important is watching. But in Judge Judy's courtroom, everyone is important. And the cameras are always rolling. The music rose gently beneath the final image. An empty courtroom, chairs straight, gavel resting. The light through the windows long and golden and patient. The screen faded slowly to black. Quiet. Final. True. A title opens doors. Character decides what you do once you're inside.